My Tank is Fight, Deranged Inventions of World War II by Zack Parsons. Narrated by Patrick Lawlor. Copyright 2006 by Zack Parsons. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Kensington Publishing Corporation and was produced in the year 2007 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Prologue. Two-Fisted Pulp History. My Tank is Fight is my attempt to create something informative, exciting, and not entirely serious. I like to call it pulp history. There are plenty of books out there on tanks, planes, and even wonder weapons of World War II, but not many of those books try to make their source material exciting. They strip the inventions down to their technical details and forget about just how incredible some of the inventions were. I wanted to create a work that took all the technical details and history, then combined that with action and humor. There is no reason anyone should feel ashamed getting excited about this stuff. These inventions would be right at home in a comic book or an Indiana Jones movie. When I was initially asked by Kensington Publishing to write a book, I pitched them several ideas. I think Cyberspace War: The Kung Fu Holocaust probably played best to my strength of describing elaborate head-kicking sequences in a dystopian future, but they felt that sort of book would be too niche. That is why they asked me to write a comedic history book about some of the strangest inventions of World War II. They believed that it would have broad appeal and a real shot at making the Oprah Book Club. Did you get that joke I made there? Because they're broads, and it would appeal to them. That is precisely the sort of cutting-edge humor you can expect from the rest of this book. My Tank is Fight is based on a series of columns I wrote for the cult humor website Something Awful. I shamelessly stole the title from a song by The Darkest of the Hillside Thickets and slapped it over the top of a bunch of mediocre articles I had written about tanks, jets, and various other inventions of World War II. The articles were inexplicably well received, so when the time came for me to transform my internet rambling into a book, these articles made an obvious choice. Next to the inventions, my greatest inspiration for this book has been all the old space exploration books aimed at adolescents. I have fond childhood memories of a book about a human mission to Mars projected to get underway by 1998 that included fabulous domed greenhouses and little adobe habitats. It was as if the authors based the books on a doodle some NASA guy had made on his notebook and decided that was science enough for them. But those books had fantastic color illustrations of rockets leaping into the sky and space conquered by square-jawed astronauts and their dreamy space wives. They told the tales of a future that I could almost believe possible if I let my cynicism melt away. Real or not, they were inspiring to me. Most of the inventions included in this book are the same sort of fantastic creations of minds with big ideas and little connection to reality. Some of these inventions were nearly realized during World War II, and others were years away from being possible. Some of these inventions influenced technological development for decades to come, and others were rightfully abandoned by their creators. These were big dreams of powerful weapons and new or strange technologies. I have attempted to tell a tale of a past that you can almost believe possible, if you let your cynicism melt away. I hope it's an exciting vision of a war changed by science gone out of control. The Nazis. The majority of the inventions covered in this book are German in origin. The desperation of Nazi Germany in the latter years of World War II led to a madcap renaissance of sorts. With Germany nearly beaten, any idea that might shift the odds back in its favor was entertained. Devices and schemes that other nations rejected out of hand would often proceed through several phases of development before termination. Excellent ideas that were simply too ambitious for a nation being beset on all sides by its enemies were pursued regardless of cost. These inventions often wasted resources and hastened the downfall of Germany. Japan, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union all contributed incredible and often preposterous inventions during World War II as well. This book is not intended to make the Germans out to be the only nation creating silly machines. They simply had more of them. Conversely, this book is not intended to romanticize Nazi Germany. National Socialism was a horrible ideology, made even worse in the hands of a racist psychopath like Adolf Hitler. The Holocaust and the tens of millions of other civilian and military deaths are the greatest human tragedy of all time. During the fictionalized portions of the book, I decided to focus on one character from the United States, one from the Soviet Union, and two from Nazi Germany. I did my best to portray all four characters as genuinely good and likable people, as I think most of the people who fought and died in the war, in all wars, are essentially good. Section 1. Land. Chapter 1. Panzerkampfwagen 8, Maus. Overview. If you ever find yourself in the mood to develop the world's largest armored fighting vehicle, the Germans would like to recommend that you name it after something really small. Maybe you could go with the flea, or the amoeba, or maybe even the quark. The Germans went with the mouse, and look where it got them. On second thought, don't look where it got them, because they spent half a century divided by the nations that defeated them. But hey, no one will forget good old go-getter Germany. They say there is no such thing as bad publicity. I'm looking at you, Holocaust Museum. The mouse is perhaps the most well-known of the superweapons still under development at the end of World War II. A functional prototype was finished, complete with armament, and survives in sort of restored condition in a Russian museum. The mouse was enormous. It still dwarfs almost all modern armored vehicles, and adding to the mystique surrounding the mouse are persistent rumors that the completed prototype was used in battle against the advancing Soviets. It is unlikely that the mouse saw combat, but it is extremely difficult not to love the Germans' ironic humor in naming their largest tank after a diminutive mammal. Development history. The development of the Panzer VIII Maus traces its roots back to 1941, when the German manufacturer Krupp began a comprehensive study of Soviet heavy tanks. It was believed at the time that Soviet tanks of the KV series were precursors to a line of Soviet super heavy tanks. With this mistaken belief came an order from Adolf Hitler to begin design on a tank to succeed the Tiger, which was at the time entering pre-production. The order specified a tank weighing up to 90 tons, armed with either a 105mm or 150mm anti-tank gun, with a 5-man crew, and a maximum speed of 44 kilometers per hour, kph. Krupp submitted plans for two versions, light and heavy, of a tank it nicknamed Loa, or Lion. Hitler put Der Führer's rubber stamp on the project in 1942 and ordered Krupp to ditch the light Lion in favor of the supersized version. Along with the order to proceed on the Lion came a number of design tweaks. The heavy Lion initially included 100mm of frontal armor protection, the same as the Tiger, that Hitler wanted increased to 140mm. That's over an inch of mild steel, so that's not exactly an easy adjustment when weight factors in, especially when Hitler's next request was for an increase in the vehicle's speed. The Krupp design for the heavy Lion topped out at a pitiful 23 kph. Hitler demanded 30 kph of blood be squeezed out of the stone. Oh yes, Krupp designers. Did we mention that the Führer himself has also asked you to change that 105mm gun to the 150mm gun? Krupp set to work making revisions while simultaneously hoping for the development of some sort of anti-gravity metal. In late March 1942, Hitler pulled the rug out from under the Krupp design team on the Heavy Lion project. He instructed Krupp to join forces with one of his favorite designers, Ferdinand Porsche, in the development of a tank in the 120-ton range. To keep everyone happy, production of the eventual tank was to be split between Krupp and Alket. In April 1942, the Mammoth began to take shape on the drawing boards to meet a firm summer of 1943 deadline for the first pre-production model. Because of production delays in the as-yet-unseen 150mm anti-tank gun, Hitler agreed to a turret mounting both the 128mm KWK-44L55 and the 75mm KWK-44L 36.5. These would be used until such a time as turrets and armament became available for the 150mm model. After more than a year of design and multiple name changes, the Maus emerged in the form of a wooden mock-up presented to Hitler in May 1943. This design weighed in at a bridge-bending 188 tons and required a specially designed railway car for transport. Hitler ordered a production run of 150 because he liked big tanks and I cannot lie. By the time the first turretless prototype chassis from Alkit was undergoing testing at the Porsche Böblingen facility in December 1943, Hitler had already rescinded his production order. The prototype was dramatically underpowered, and further development continued despite the project's cancellation. By the summer of 1944, Krupp reported that 4 hulls were nearing completion. Shortly thereafter, all 4 hulls were ordered scrapped. Even then, work continued on the Maus. In September 1944, the second prototype began testing at the Kummersdorf Proving Ground. This V2 prototype was equipped with a partially completed turret and dummy armament for testing purposes. When the Kummersdorf facility was overrun by the Soviets in 1945, the V2 prototype was destroyed. Accounts indicate that it was destroyed by the Germans to prevent its capture, although there is some fanciful speculation that it engaged the Soviets in the defense of Kummersdorf. The V1 prototype and a third hull section were recovered from the facility by the Soviets. The V1 prototype survives with the repaired V2 turret mounted on it at the Museum of Armored Forces in Kubinka, Russia. Technical mumbo-jumbo. The original Maus prototype was powered by a Daimler-Benz aircraft engine and only capable of a top speed of 13 kph. Compared to the Maus, the original Heavy Lion design looked like a drag racer. Attempts to resolve the speed problem by replacing the original aircraft engine with a higher horsepower diesel engine met with very little success. Because of the ponderous weight and high profile of the Maus, the tracks were extremely wide, 1.1 meters each, and featured 12 return rollers on a Skoda volute suspension. Compounding the speed problem, the Maus was also incapable of crossing almost all bridges because of its 188-ton weight. As a workaround, the Maus was equipped with an electric drive snorkeling system capable of a fording depth of 8 meters. For those of you not up to speed on your European river depth charts, 8 meters of snorkeling depth would have left the Maus choking on water in a number of major rivers. Adding insult to injury, if a Maus ever suffered a mechanical failure on the battlefield, it was determined that 2 additional Maus tanks would be required for towing. The main armament for the Maus was a 128mm KWK-44L55, which was virtually identical to the one mounted in the Jagdtiger. This was a very formidable weapon and could engage and destroy all Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 3 kilometers. Secondary armament was coaxial in line with the 128mm gun in the turret and consisted of a 75mm KWK-44L 36.5. This secondary armament matched that of the early models of the Panzer IV and was intended to fire high explosive rounds to engage infantry and softer targets. A 7.92mm MG-34 machine gun was also mounted coaxially for engaging infantry. The turret was designed to be equipped with a Zeiss rangefinder, and the production model would have likely incorporated German infrared equipment. See Chapter 5. The Maus sported 200mm thick front armor well angled at 35 degrees. The turret was even more heavily armored. The sheer sides of the Maus were more lightly armored and vulnerable to super heavy anti-tank weaponry in the same class as that carried by the Maus. The thinner deck armor was also vulnerable to bombs or rockets launched from the air. Variants. The primary production variant of the Maus was to be a version mounting the 150mm KWK L38 in place of the 128mm and 75mm combination platter. A further upgunned version was envisioned with a non-existent 170mm anti-tank weapon. An anti-air design dubbed the Flak-Zwilling 8.8 cm Auf Maus was also tentatively planned. This variant would have mounted two deadly 88mm flak guns in a special turret designed for engaging air targets. This version of the Maus might have actually surpassed the original in terms of all-around effectiveness. The 88mm remained a dangerous weapon throughout the entire war. Though it lacked the punch of the 128mm main gun, this would have been offset by the fact that two of them in a flak turret would have given fighter bombers in the area something to think twice about. Analysis. According to Porsche, the final intent of the Maus was to plug gaps in the Atlantic Wall as a slightly mobile fortress. A sedentary role like this would have certainly avoided the mobility problems with the Maus, but it seems ridiculous when bunkers and emplaced guns could have been, and were, produced much more rapidly and cheaply than the Maus. For a more believable view of the intended purpose of the Maus, I think it's best to look at when the project was begun. In the spring of 1942, the Germans were concerned about running into Soviet super heavy tanks. They had suffered some setbacks in the Soviet Union during the winter of 1941-42, but spring and summer saw the Germans advancing even farther into Soviet territory than before. This was a victorious Germany, still on the rise portion of the rise and fall of the Third Reich. Ultimately, Hitler's decision to cancel official development of the Maus in late 1943 was one of his increasingly rare good ideas. Had the Maus entered service in late 1943 as planned, it might have had a significant psychological impact on the enemy. This effect would have gradually faded as tacticians developed solid ways to take a Maus out of action. Given the pathetic speed and extremely high visible profile of the Maus, I feel this would have happened in a month or less, depending on how numerous and vigorously employed the Maus was. Considered in a vacuum devoid of the realities of war, the Maus was a mighty tank. It was armed and armored so heavily that the sight of one might give pause to an entire company of Allied tanks. Then reality and infantry would creep up and throw demolition charges onto it when it inevitably got stuck somewhere, or P-51s would dive from the sky and blast holes in it with rockets and bombs. Maybe a bold tank commander in a Pershing would circumnavigate it and put a plug in its rear armor. Whatever its fate, the Maus was by no means the unobtainable, invulnerable tank that Hitler so desperately wanted. Instead, it was a magnificent waste of resources. Hypothetical deployment history. Superschweres Panzerabteilung 400 departed from mustering near Stuttgart on December 6, 1943, under the command of General Major Ferdinand Schuft. Rail bridges in the vicinity of Ulm were incapable of carrying the entrained unit, so the 16 Maus tanks of the Abteilung were forced to dismount and ford across the Danube. Low waters were found, and the Maus tanks were able to cross without using their snorkels. Despite this, 4 tanks became inextricably mired in the freezing mud because of their weight and were left behind for engineering teams to recover. The remainder of the unit traveled on by rail to Krakow and was joined in late December by the surviving Maus detachment. By then, a 5th tank had become disabled due to overstressing of the suspension. It was cannibalized for parts and then dynamited by engineers of the sapper platoon. Its turret survived as a gun emplacement. During their travel, the Maus tanks had attracted a good deal of attention, despite efforts to move in secrecy. Persistent attack by Soviet aircraft forced the tanks into nocturnal travel schedules and resulted in a 6th Maus being lost to a frozen pond concealed by snow in the vicinity of Zhytomyr. Superschweres Panzerabteilung 400 linked up with units of the 17th Corps and formed a defensive line west of Zhytomyr in preparation for a counterattack. A Soviet offensive to encircle Zhytomyr had begun on Christmas Day and was still underway. On December 26th, Schuft detached a platoon of Maus tanks to bolster the defenses within the city. German forces had already retreated into the city itself, and bitter fighting was erupting all along the eastern fringe of Zhytomyr. On December 27th, the Russians encountered a mouse of the superschweres Panzerabteilung. 11 Soviet tanks, including 2 heavy tanks, were lost before the mouse was disabled by a hit to the suspension. German forces destroyed the abandoned tank, and over the following days were forced to retreat into the outskirts of the city. Soviet forces pushed in toward Zhytomyr, hammering it with artillery in an effort to close the pincer around the Germans. General Major Schuft, who had been ordered to hold his remaining tanks in reserve, advanced on January 5th against heavy Russian resistance and temporarily smashed the leading edge of the northern arm of the encirclement. 2 Maus tanks were disabled but later repaired, and a third was abandoned and destroyed. Despite urgings by officers in the Zhytomyr area, Hitler refused to allow retreat. Photographs of the Maus began to appear in German and Allied print media. The U.S. and British press enraged Hitler by repeatedly referring to the Maus tanks as Hitler's only battleships. The Germans released a newsreel showing the Abteilung 400 in formation before embarkation at Stuttgart. Joseph Stalin countered soon after with footage of Soviet troops laughing and lounging on the wreckage of a Maus tank. Encirclement of the Zhytomyr area was completed by the first week of January, but tenacious resistance kept the pincer porous. Abteilung 400, by then reduced to only 4 Maus tanks, effected a breakout to the west through blizzard conditions with survivors from other units in the Kessel. During the retreat west, all Maus tanks experienced breakdowns and were abandoned and destroyed. Further production of the Maus was halted, and Superschweres Panzerabteilung 400 was disbanded. On March 4th, General Major Schuft was transferred to the top-secret Landkreuzerbefiel Phoenix, being formed in Berlin. What Fight Have Been? 11:05 a.m., December 28, 1943. Ukrainian Front, 1st Ukrainian Front, Special Sniper Detachment, Zhytomyr, Ukraine. Avdotia Donetskov settled like a snowflake on the fallen timbers of the second floor of the Zhytomyr cinema. She did not make a sound louder than her own heartbeat. She pressed her body flat and slid forward a centimeter at a time until she was beneath an incidental lean-to of wood and curling wallpaper. She pulled her cloak over her furry sable ushanka and gave the wallpaper around her a gentle tug so that a thin rivulet of snow powdered her head. The white scarf she wore around her neck and over her mouth directed her exhaled breath back down across her prone body. In moments, the snow falling from the sky had covered her legs and frozen Valenki boots. Avdotia waited patiently until she felt completely confident that she was concealed and unseen. She pressed her eyes to the German scope of her Russian rifle. She had earned the scope in one of the most harrowing sniper duels of her life. She had bested the German in the streets of Stalingrad and taken his scope as a trophy. That city had never fully belonged to the Germans, but Zhytomyr still did. The majority of the fighting was still to the east, and the Soviet artillery was only just beginning to range the outskirts. Soon it would be falling all around the cinema. But Avdotia would be long gone. In the heavy snow, Avdotia's ears proved better than her eyes, even with the German scope. She heard the clatter-clack of the tank's treads resolving beneath the constant thump of artillery landing to the east. They became louder and louder, though the sound did not initially concern her. She had been near many of the fascists' tanks and had put lead through a dozen foolish tank commanders. The cinema was situated at the flattened top of a T intersection. The tanks appeared as ominous shapes in the blowing snow. They moved so slowly that at first she presumed them to be idling, but the sound of their engines grew louder and louder. They were nearly a block away, and already their engines were shaking the structure around her, but at last she could make them out clearly. They were mammoths, the likes of which she had never seen before. German tanks were always ugly, but these were exceptional. They were huge beasts, like slabs of iron with tracks so wide that there seemed little space between them and their boxy turrets, mounted with multiple heavy guns. They were hastily whitewashed, piled up with snow, and she could see none bore the telltale pockmarks of battle. This was something new. Along with the tanks came the infantry. They were veterans with frozen, snow-caked beards, wearing white smocks and boots stolen from dead Russians. Many had painted their rifles white or wrapped them up in pillowcases. The column of tanks and infantry came to a halt just before the T intersection, and the commander of the lead tank jumped down from the turret. Avdotia watched him carefully through her rifle's scope. He was lean compared to the infantrymen bundled in their multiple layers of clothing. He simply wore a white parka over an insulated coverall. Though he seemed reasonably youthful, his face was heavily lined and scarred, so that the deep cuts of past battles overlapped into his prematurely weathered features. A German infantryman began an animated conversation with the tanker, gesturing east down the T of the intersection. Avdotia knew from infiltration of Zhytomyr the night before that he was pointing to the front lines being hammered by Soviet artillery. There were hundreds of soldiers there, dug in deep, with anti-tank guns and well-sighted machine gun bunkers. She hoped that the artillery would clear the way for the Russian advance, but it so rarely worked out that way. The Germans could burrow into the ground like root grubs and emerge from the heaviest bombardments practically unharmed. The tanker had pulled the infantryman aside and was obviously giving the other German a good piece of his mind about what he thought of the plan of attack. The two Germans were several paces away from the tanks and sheltered in the doorway of an abandoned barber's shop. Avdotia had a perfect shot on them, and the loud rumble of the tanks might even cover the noise. She squeezed her left eye shut and took aim at the tanker's chest. At this range she was reasonably sure of a good headshot, but with the wind and snow she was not going to take any risks. Her finger wrapped around the trigger. Her breathing stilled. Something dark swept past her line of fire. She immediately opened her other eye and saw that it was a boy, no more than 8, wrapped up in a winter coat and running like a fool toward the column of tanks. He held a German stick grenade in one hand with the pull pin held in the other, ready to yank it free and hurl the grenade. It was a sad distraction, but the boy's sacrifice would buy her the chance to kill both Germans instead of one. They were moving. They had seen the boy. She tried to get a line of fire, but the tanker had grabbed the boy by the wrists and was struggling with him. The boy screamed and dropped the grenade, but the pull pin remained wrapped in his fingers. The tanker grabbed it and threw it over a rooftop, but it did not explode. To Avdotia's amazement, the tanker shoved aside the machine pistol the infantryman had aimed at the boy. He shouted, "Go home!" angrily in Russian and slapped the boy on the face. It defied belief. Avdotia would have shot a child trying to blow up her countrymen. The infantryman obviously shared her opinion as he began to yell angrily at the tanker. The German turned away to watch the boy leave by an alleyway running between the cinema and a nearby brick hostel. Something, the scope, a glint from her gun barrel, caught the tanker's eye. He looked right at Avdotia, right through the lens of her scope. There was a fleeting moment where they were frozen together, apart from the world. Then gunfire erupted in the street below. Wood splinters showered Avdotia's rooftop shooting blind, and bullets hissed past her head. With a loud whine, the lead tank's turret began to swivel toward her. It was move or die. She slid back quickly from the shattered facade of the cinema and scrambled for the stairs. She threw herself painfully down the stairs as the world exploded. A second blast tore through the ground floor of the cinema an instant later and flung her through the remnants of the back wall. Pain shot through her ribcage as something snapped. Avdotia grunted and rolled out into the snow. She tasted blood and was half blind with shock. The deadly gravity of unconsciousness dragged at her, but Avdotia resisted. She struggled to her knees, and then her feet, and ran for her life. Chapter 2. Landcruiser P-1000 Rata. Overview. The world will probably never see an armored land vehicle on the scale of the Rata. Tellingly, Germans didn't even refer to it as a tank. They called it a land cruiser. The Rata was so large that its dimensions had more in common with a naval vessel than a tank. It had the crew complement of at least 4 heavy tanks, armament usually seen mounted on heavy cruisers such as the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and enough anti-aircraft weaponry to ward off waves of attacking fighter bombers. It was 35 meters long, as tall as some church steeples, and so wide that maneuvering in an urban area would have been either impossible or apocalyptic. The rata was so heavy that it would have shattered and churned pavement like a plow through sod and collapsed all but a handful of bridges in Germany. The rata's much smaller cousin, the mouse, turned out to be a ruinous waste of resources for very limited applications in combat. Had the rata's development progressed even a fraction as far as the mouse, it would have...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?